Would like to welcome you to the ICMA Courageous Conversations today. And we have an amazing group of professionals and stories that I think you will not only find interesting, but it may give you real skills to be able to communicate in a more effective way. So we have Steve Ruger from Rancho, New Mexico, who has agreed to be our moderator. And with that, welcome to each one of you who is on the call, and I will turn the mic to Steve.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for virtually joining us today. Happy Pride Month, which is kind of serendipitous for why we're here talking to you today. So we have a panel of members of the LGBTQ+ community, and we'd like to kind of share some of our stories and thoughts with you all, and certainly leave some room to answer any questions that you may have as we try to tackle the issue of what does this community look like in public service at the local level and in local government administration, and what do we see differently and what do you see differently? And I hope you'll get some really good insight from this. So first of all, we're all friends here, so appreciate everyone being very respectful in the conversation, and really, this is just a great time for us to kind of come together, A, as a group and a team, but also B, for a really important topic. So I'm going to kind of go through and introduce our panelists. We have Eric Osterberg. He's joining us from, I believe it's Klamath Falls, Oregon. We have Steve Rogers, and you're from the Napa Valley. What's the name of your town, Steve?
Yountville, California.
Yountville. And so if you need wine suggestions, I think Steve would be the one to go to.
Wine.
And then we have the lovely Pam Davis from the city of Boulder, Colorado, a fellow neighbor of mine and tremendous lady. We do have another panelist as well, Alex from Ventura, California. I don't see him on. Alex, are you there somewhere and I'm not seeing you? Okay, well, we will just go with the four of us then for now and get started. So I'm going to ask each one of our members to kind of give an introduction of their selves and tell us a little bit about what it's like being a member of the LGBTQ+ community in working in local government. So Eric, if you don't mind, let's start with you. Like me, you're a dual minority. I'm left-handed. I'm just kidding. But maybe you can talk to us about your experiences in local government and where you're at, and really what I think might be fascinating is kind of the difference between being African-American and also being gay, and how that impacts how you react to people and how that impacts your ability to lead. But we'd really like your story.
Yeah, so hello everybody, my name is Eric Osterberg. I'm currently the assistant over here at the city of Klamath Falls. Klamath Falls is at the very, very southern tip of Oregon. We are just only about 10 to 15 minutes from the Northern California border. My story is I think is somewhat unique in that I'm a conversion therapy survivor. Between the ages of 11 and 14, my parents had sent me to a school in Utah with the intent of kind of praying the gay away. Made it out of that with my head on my shoulders somehow. But, throughout my career in city management, I have most often been not forward with my sexuality because of my race. I already knew that coming into city management, a predominantly white field, that I was going to have to navigate the racial dimension, and that's not something that I can mute or hide about myself. Whereas my sexuality, that's something that I don't have to be as open about. And that, again, that was driven because I already knew I was gonna have to manage perceptions around a Black man being in city management. I'll say that just a brief couple of kind of stories in my recent history. I was a finalist for a town manager position in Colorado. I was sure I was going to get the position, and the town attorney called me and told me that they weren't going to be moving forward with me as a candidate, and he put himself on the line of attorney-client privilege to communicate to me that something that was not under my control, that had no bearing on my professional capabilities, was brought up as a concern. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, your sexuality. So that was pretty distressing, but I still got back on my feet and went back out into the job market and found something. Here at the city of Klamath Falls, it was the first time in my career that I had decided to be open about my sexuality, and that was a pretty interesting experience. When I first landed here, I wrote a organization-wide welcome email just talking about myself, and I had just simply mentioned that I had a partner named David. So two and two together, obviously that's me communicating that I'm gay. Our city manager here shared with me that he received several, so more than 3 phone calls from staff members around the organization, kind of warning him that that wasn't a good idea to hire a gay man. So I was very glad that I had a really good ally in my city manager, and that he immediately, each time he received one of these calls, said, what bearing does Eric's sexuality have on his ability to do the job? And that kind of shut it down. Since then, I've not had anybody make any sort of unseemly comment about it, and I'm pretty pleased about that. But what that really taught me is that what's absolutely essential to me feeling comfortable coming out is just having that kind of support. I will end my kind of story there.
Steve, you're on mute.
Thank you very much.
You think I'd get this down by now? But thanks so much, Eric. One of the things I wanted to mention to the group, we had a side conversation last week, and I had the privilege of hearing Eric's story a little bit more detailed than what he just shared with you. But one of the things he said that really resonated with me was, in applying for future jobs, he's not going to disclose necessarily that he's gay right away. He's going to wait till he actually gets into the office before that conversation even happens. So that's one of the issues that I think we still face in certain parts of the country when we think about moving our careers to another location. What are the politics like there? And one of the things that always strikes me is, just maybe some stigma that because you're gay, you might be coming with a very progressive agenda. So I think there are some issues that happen with that, but it just breaks my heart to know that Eric's a little timid to even tell people he's gay when applying for jobs, just for fear of having exactly what happened to him, which is everybody's worst nightmare.
So I would be hesitant to describe that as me being timid. That's just
right.
Me
sure.
realistic about the situations that I might find myself in. And, I really feel that it's really only appropriate to have discussions about my professional capabilities rather than personal aspects of myself during the interview process.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. I think that's fair. All right, well, let's go over to Pam next.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me back. I had the pleasure of speaking with you all a few months ago as it related to women in the profession, and it's great to now be here kind of speaking about another dimension of my story, which is that I happen to be a lesbian on top of everything else. So it's great to be with you. I'm the assistant city manager of the city of Boulder. I do serve as our LGBTQ community liaison as well, which is great to be able to bring that part of my identity to bear professionally. And then I also, and I'm going to put some info in the chat in a minute, I am the board chair for an organization called Civic Pride, which is a small startup professional association with the mission to advance LGBTQ leadership in local government. And so I want to share a little bit about an upcoming event we have. For me, I cannot separate my professional identity from my history as a teenager growing up gay in high school. For me, actually, what set me on the path to pursue a career in government was my experience coming out as a teenager in high school. After coming out, my best friend and I came out around the same time, and we faced a great deal of bullying and harassment in our high school in North Scottsdale, Arizona, and a very kind of conservative part of the city. And through that experience, we really learned how to find our voice and become advocates for ourselves and safer schools. And we started a Gay Straight Alliance at our school back in high school. And that kind of led me to first develop an interest in sort of political activism. We had to essentially fight with our high school administration to get that club started. And in the process of working through starting that Gay Straight Alliance Club, we discovered that the law was on our side, that we had a federal protection called the Equal Access Act, that because we attended public school and the school received funding, that the school could not deny our right to start an extracurricular club. And that was like one of the biggest light bulb kind of aha moments in my whole life, which was that policies that are developed at any level of government for a particular purpose, in this case, the Equal Access Act had been created to protect religious clubs' right to form, also applied in our situation and also allowed our club to get started. And it kind of turned me on to this idea that, you know, nameless, faceless people thousands of miles away, by doing the public service that they did, actually made my life better. It actually protected my ability to do something and to grow and to have a safe space. And it really turned me on to the power of government, which I think is in some ways a little bit of a rare experience, because so often through the 90s and early 2000s, the LGBT community was experiencing enhanced oppression from our governments, both locally and federally, and with efforts to really hold us back. And this was one rare case in the midst of all this where I found some strength in government. So that really set me on the path that I'm on today, and led me to want to be a part of this institution that could make people's lives better. And so I think as a result of that being part of my origin story, when I discovered specifically city management and working in this profession, it was only natural for me to kind of carry that mission with me through my career. When I was a grad student in my MPA program and seeking mentors, one of my questions was like, where are the gay city managers? And this was back in about 2012, 2013. And it would only be a couple of years later that ICMA would print its first article in PM magazine. And I believe the title actually was something along the lines of like, where are the gay city managers? Something along those lines, written by my good friend, Phil Smith-Haynes. And that really set us up for a little bit more visibility within the profession. I think as I came to learn joining the profession, there was quite kind of the underground network and unspoken network of LGBTQ managers throughout ICMA membership and the profession at large. But for me coming in, given my experiences and given some of the changes that were occurring pretty rapidly at this point in the United States around LGBTQ issues, I just really wanted to see myself in the profession and make sure that there was a place for me and make sure this was a place I was going to be safe, because I had been out for and active for so long that it was important to me that there was that visibility. And so, you know, connecting with some of the greats like Pat Martell and Phil and Tony Winnie and many others who I know are on this call today was a really amazing experience for me to say, okay, like I can continue to work on this profession and there will be a place for me here. So as I evolved, I kind of gradually, you know, earlier in my career, it was less in the forefront. My sexuality was less in the forefront in terms of what I brought into a room. But as I grew and I saw the impact that me being out could have for other people in the profession, just by saying who I was and what I was about, and talk proudly about my now wife, Leanne, and we now have a son, Russell. He's responsible for me losing my voice right now because he brought home a cold from daycare last week. You know, it's been a really incredible opportunity, I think, to bring the same thing that we brought to my high school, you know, 20 years ago into the professional space. And so the growth of civic pride, the ability to be an LGBTQ liaison here in Boulder has been amazing. It's helped me to explore and understand the role that local government does have in shaping the lives of queer people in our own communities. We're fortunate here in Boulder County to have an amazing nonprofit called Out Boulder County, and they've become our community partner in making Boulder as inclusive as possible. And it's led to some really tangible things. I think for a lot of folks, when we talk about LGBTQ inclusion, and even for us folks who are gay in our roles, I think it can be challenging to balance the line between where am I just like being that gay person who won't shut up about gay stuff, versus, no, I'm a professional and public administrator, and my mission is to create an equitable government that serves all people. And I happen to have personal experience that I can bring to bear to help make that possible. And trying to kind of balance that persona and push for things and not be dismissed by virtue of my identity has been very much an art as I've grown in my career. And now we're to the point, which is great, here in Boulder, where kind of each year we decide what are those couple of things we're going to take care of this year to make our city more inclusive for LGBTQ people. So a couple of years ago, it was updating our building codes to enforce that all single stall restrooms constructed in the city must be gender neutral. You know, we got that done in 2020. This year, we're working on an anti-bullying policy for youth who are engaged in city services, and the ability to fight against bullying when we see that happen in our REX programs and things like that. When we do our own capital planning, you know, we make accessibility and state-of-the-art gender neutral multi-stall bathrooms now in the city as a symbol for the rest of the community, things like that. And so it's been really fun to go from this very emotional journey in realizing who I was and finding my place in the world to now be in a position to use that authority to actually make life better for others. And that's really what it was about all along. So I'm going to throw a couple links in the chat, but I will hand over the mic for now because we've got some other amazing speakers.
Thanks, Pam, and really thanks for all your work on trying to, you know, tackle the role of building a network. So my one question before you log off on the mic: do you have to be a member of the LGBTQ plus community to be a part of Civic Pride?
No, not at all. So the mission of Civic Pride is really to support LGBTQ public servants. And so if you're someone who agrees with that mission, we want you to be a part of our group and participate in our programs. We're as much about education and connection across the profession as we are about building connections within the LGBTQ community. So what I'm about to share is definitely wide open for everybody.
Great, thanks, Pam. All right, Steve Rogers, let's hear from you next, please.
Well, thank you. And it's really exciting to hear Pam and Eric's stories and contributions. I'm a little older, so I'm going to give a generational perspective, and it's both, it's got some challenging parts and some very rewarding parts. Currently, I am the town manager for the town of Yountville, and I've been serving for 14 years. And I'm also the president of the League of California City Managers Department. So, but I am going to share that generational perspective over 35 years. In 1992, I was about 5 years in the profession and was looking to move up. And that's when I finally came out. I was raised in the Midwest, small town Catholic, you know, tried to deny everything for a long time. And I'm putting it back in perspective for everybody so that you realize the late 80s and early 90s were a very different environment. And I think it's really exciting to where we've come from. But as I was coming out and it became known, one night after a council meeting, 2 council members were walking in the aisleway with me, and they pulled me over, and they in no sense made it very clear that people like me should not be working in local government. Now, I say that because that was devastating to me. I grew up in a family where my parents were on boards and commissions in a small town. I'm passionate about local government. So here was the wind just being taken right out from me, you know, because how can I work in this if that's how the people I'm working for believe? We also didn't have support structures back then. The environment was very different and challenging to find a level of support. So I almost really nearly left the profession because I just didn't know how I belonged. Fortunately, I had a very good city manager and others that encouraged me, and we took a pause, and then we started going, all right, if you know, I have something to give and work, we now need to be more strategic. So for me, a lot of that at that point in time was identifying communities that were going to be more comfortable and accepting. So the good news is that's a path that I used. It's been very successful for me. I got out of that environment and into one that was more appropriate. So I think that's a bit of advice that I think everybody still needs to look at is, how and where, and is it a good fit for you? I'm also a bit more reserved. In part, that's just my general nature. So for me, my coming out stories have been more one-on-one. I've learned to never deny who I am if somebody asks, but I don't necessarily put it out there. And in fact, kind of ironically, it was kind of funny. I have actually been at community events and, being thanked for being a friend of the community when I'm actually a member of the community. So that was somewhat intriguing. So one of the more interesting things now is, to Eric's point, there's still conversations. When I was hired here in Yountville and they were doing the reference check on me, one of the former city managers I worked for, made sure that they knew I was gay. So those things are still out there, even in Northern California. We're an hour and a half so north of San Francisco. But it's also an interesting experience for me. About 4 years ago, I had the privilege to speak to the League of California Cities City Clerks Association, and they were talking about city manager relationships with clerks. And panel, myself, two very esteemed female city managers, and one of the questions came up, have you ever had any issues of harassment or issues that led to you, workplace issues? I can guarantee you that the room was really not expecting the older white male in the crowd to lead off and say that experience. And I also say, for me, it's an interesting one because my approach has generally been more of the one-on-one reserved nature. And, telling that story in front of 500 people was not easy, even in today's environment. But I think I want to share also, the environment's really changed. I have a very supportive council. I even have council members that have tried to find dates for me. I'm not sure that's a good strategy. But about 6 years ago, our community became one of the first in the Napa Valley to raise the pride flag. And it was really meaningful to me because the council made a point to bring me over and actually include me in raising the flag. So I do want to share that I think, the situation's different, and I'm very excited. Pam and Phil Haynes-Smith, who I hired when I was in San Bruno, there's just so much positiveness. But I do think, for me, it's been challenging and very rewarding. And that's why I'm just super excited to see the kind of conversations, because in 1992, I didn't know where to go. And now the good news is there's support groups, encouragement, and it's recognized and we're valued. And I think that's the most important thing, because we have incredible contributions. And Pam's so spot on about the fact that we have an ability to contribute and make a difference in the communities. And that's what everybody gets involved in local government for. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Steve. And I really appreciate you highlighting kind of your generational perspective. And I'm somewhere kind of middle career. I'm 41, and so I've seen some changes too. When I entered the profession, there really wasn't a lot of talk about being gay in the profession. There really wasn't a lot of interest in talking specifically about what that means. One of the questions Felicia brought up last week when we were having kind of a casual conversation is, does a gay or a lesbian city manager, or maybe a transgender city manager, manage any different than anyone else? And I think, Steve, you really kind of hit the nail on the head, where we all bring a unique perspective to the profession. And so I think we all have our own unique way of managing a city, and we all have unique contributions based on our individual backgrounds. But what I like to see us, unite on with the elected officials, fellow staff, and with our colleagues in the community is just the overall love of public service. To me, that's kind of the fundamental reason that we're all here. So, if we can project out that passion, to me, that should usurp any differences we have. But that's just my personal opinion. We have a couple of questions already in the chat. I'm going to talk a little bit about my story real quick, just so you know who I am. So I'm Steve, and I'm the Deputy City Manager of Rio Rancho, New Mexico, and I'm imagining not a lot of you have heard about Rio Rancho. It's a fascinating community. We're going to be, hopefully after the census data is released, over 100,000 residents. We're the largest suburb of city of Albuquerque. And so we're kind of between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, really beautiful area if you like the desert Southwest. Pretty conservative community, oddly enough. But our demographics, we're actually more racially diverse than Boulder. But we have some very interesting challenges here. But my experience, I've actually worked for the city, barring a 2-year stint in the city of Aurora, Colorado, since 2005. And I got passed over for a promotion, later to find out it was because I was gay. Also, when the Supreme Court ruling came out, I think it was 2013, one of our council members who's staunchly Catholic said in a council meeting, he hopes everybody who pursues that lifestyle in our community will be God-fearing and think more about their actions. So that's a message that an elected official is not only sending the community, but at the time I was city clerk sitting in that council meeting, hearing that, and it's just really hard. You have to just kind of, take it in stride. And honestly, it does hurt. And it's stuck with me to this day. So there are a lot of things that still happen, even into the 20 teens, even into today's world that we still need to be mindful of and really need to challenge ourselves on how are we going to stand up for that? How are we going to make sure biases are not expressed per se? Certainly everyone's entitled to an opinion, but we all need to bond on our same mission, I think, of good public service. But it is kind of scary for me when I think about my next step, which hopefully will be a city manager position. I very much will be conscious about where I'm applying based on my sexuality, and really have that conversation with myself about, is this someplace that because of who I am, I'm going to be less effective because of politics and stigma per se. So it's just something that's kind of to the fore in my mind, and I'm sure other panelists have gone through that as well, and anybody else who really has any kind of difference. So there's not a lot of questions, so I'll let the panelists kind of interject as they see. But the first question though that did come up, and let's see if I pulled it up here. So it is from John Doan, and it says, is there any data on the number of openly LGBTQ+ in the profession? I don't think we track that. Pam, you might be better to speak to that. I think through Civic Pride, maybe we can start at least realizing that there's probably more than we would think. But does anybody on the panel know of any metrics that are tracked, or is there any kind of a count?
So I do believe in the last couple of years, ELGL's voluntary diversity dashboard project that they've run did start asking that question. I don't have the numbers at the top of my mind, but I'll do a quick search, and if I can get a hold of it, I'll put it in the chat.
Great, thanks, Pam. So that's actually the only question, actual question in the chat. But certainly we'd love to have any other questions or anything else that you all are thinking. We really wanted to dedicate some time for questions that we can answer. And if not, that's fine too. So I'll bring something up that happened to me recently that might be beneficial for the people on the call. I had someone come up to me in a hallway at the office in front of other staff members, and it wasn't mean-spirited, and it wasn't meant to be offensive, but this person asked me if I could explain to them what being transgender is. And quite frankly, being a gay man, I don't feel qualified to speak on transgender issues. I don't identify with that, nor do I feel like I'm an expert. Certainly I have friends in the community, and I respect their rights and their choices and their ability to live life as they please. But that's one of the things that can be frustrating, I think, for us who are in the LGBTQ+ community, is that we're not necessarily experts on every letter that's in that acronym. But I think we can serve in an advisory role on where you can seek out that information, just because we are kind of around that. But it is good to an extent that we're all, under that one acronym, because we do unite on similar needs and interests and wanting to be acknowledged and respected. But I can guarantee you our perceptions of the world and our experiences are vastly different based on what that letter is. So just letting you guys know that. Certainly be inquisitive, but we're probably not going to be able to tell you about gender reassignment surgery with great detail, that type of thing. So it looks like there's a couple other questions. Oh yeah, so just Felicia, thank you for that. Phil Smith-Haynes is on the line and has been called out as a friend, mentor to many. Phil's great. He's as Pam alluded to, he's one of the earliest champions for gay and lesbians in the profession. So he's just a great asset. And let's see. So John also put a comment when I was looking for a new position 11 years ago. I was very attracted to my current community when there were 3 openly gay LGBTQ+ elected officials. That safe leadership was important. That's tremendous, and I think we look out for that type of thing when we're looking at jobs. And then I'm just reading these because they're very interesting. Melanie Purcell is the parent of a trans kid and is mindful of only considering positions in states with more protective legislation. How do you consider the state environment in considering locations? Melanie, that's a tremendous point. It's not just necessarily being LGBTQ+ in the profession. You also maybe have family members that you want to think about as well. So yeah, I think I can speak for me, and I'd like to open up to our other panelists on that too. For me, it's not necessarily just the city, it's also the state as well that I would be curious about. Anybody else on the panel have any thoughts?
So I'm happy to share another resource in the chat. The Human Rights Campaign, a national advocacy organization for the LGBTQ community, conducts every year what they call their Municipal Equality Index. They have about 200 cities that they currently rate across several different dimensions of how they are inclusive to the LGBTQ community through policies, services, benefits offerings to employees, the way that they interface with the community. So I'm going to send a link to that in the chat for you all. That could be both a resource potentially for you looking at different cities that you might want to go work for or bring your family to. But also what I think is great about it is even though the Equality Index, I don't know exactly the rhyme or reason to how they pick the cities that they put on their scoreboard every year, but you can get the full rubric for how they rate cities. And so regardless of whether or not you're a city that's enrolled in that program, you can use that as a literal playbook for enhancing your city's inclusiveness. And I'd argue that there's far more beyond that rubric that you can do to make your city welcoming, and things to look out for when selecting where you might want to go. But it's a great starting point. And like I said, if you're a city that hasn't done a lot of conscientious work around supporting your LGBTQ community at this point, it's a great place to start to do a quick analysis. Some things that we've done, if you don't mind, Steve, I'll roll into Lindsay's question as well, because it kind of comes to this topic around partnering with nonprofits. I mentioned before that we're fortunate that we do have a very strong nonprofit in our community out Boulder County. And I think a lot of, you'll find a lot of these probably in more urban areas, but I think you will find even in rural areas, there's at least an informal resource of some kind at this point in a lot of places for LGBT community members that to find support and things like that. And what we've really done is just, we're fortunate in our area that they've been very forward about coming to the city and sort of saying like, how can we work together to make this better? Everything from working with our police department on, we actually have a really great partnership through them that because they're a safe space for community members, when we have alleged hate crimes or situations that arise or people in crisis that out Boulder County hears about, we have a couple of dedicated police officers as LGBT community liaisons who identify as LGBT themselves, and they become that first direct phone call to say, hey, we have someone in crisis, show up not in uniform and have a conversation with this person, because of course the much like other communities, there's a challenging history with the LGBT community and policing. And for a long time in our history, the police were the enforcement arm of enforcing gatherings and how people dressed and how people behaved. Of course, Stonewall being the most well-known example of that. So we've done things like, we have officers by name listed on the website. If you're a member of the LGBT community and you want to talk to someone who gets it, here's the direct number of a detective who will, meet you where you need to talk. We also, without Boulder, certainly anything to do with sort of pride events and things like that, we make sure the city is a part of that. We do believe in the symbolism of the flag raising, of those declarations, painting crosswalks with rainbows, things like that. Those do have an impact. That's not the beginning and the end of it. But those things, we've heard really great feedback, do send that strong message that we're a welcoming place. But then really it comes down to, like I said, things like forms. So we'll work with Boulder County. We did a review of our entire city charter for gender neutral language, for example. We worked on some city level hate crimes policies. I mentioned bathrooms already. One of the things that we're working on right now is with our business community, the way that we do business licenses and forms to start collecting data around LGBTQ owned businesses, even though that's not a federally required data source. We can still be tracking those things at the city level and helping to support business owners. So there's kind of no end to there's a lot of creativity that just because sexual orientation is not necessarily a protected class in all ways at the federal level, there are things you can do locally to still capture that data and have an understanding of what's happening in your community. And I'll stop there, but as you all know, I'm always happy to have a side conversation if there's sort of a specific initiative that you're interested in exploring and could use an ear on.
Thanks, Pam. I'm going to turn over to Felicia now. Eric also wanted to respond to Phil's question, but let's go to Felicia.
Okay, I was just making sure that we pick up the questions as we go. And Melanie Purcell has a question. Melanie, are you there and do you want to come on and just ask your question? It's in the chat box. As a parent of a trans kid, I'm mindful of only considering positions in states with more protective legislation. How do you consider the state environment in considering locations?
So thank you. I appreciate some of the comments already made. Part of what I have, I've worked all over the country. So I've had the privilege of being in quite a few states, but I'm discovering that even just the availability of medical care for children, particularly mental health care, borders on an abomination across the country, but for children who are experiencing questioning of their own gender identity, it can be catastrophic. And so I guess for me, I'm very sensitive to what all people look at. I appreciate recognizing when you have a council that's supportive or a city manager that's supportive, those change quickly. An election fries us all. So I guess part of what I was looking at is, I've written off the state of Texas, I've written off the state of Tennessee, just based on personal experience and knowledge of their legislation. But I'm curious as to what other things folks have experienced or seen, or you look for that kind of give you that trigger. I appreciate the Human Rights Commission. I do check them out pretty regularly. There's a couple of other ratings that exist. But I'm just curious kind of as people, particularly in looking through the profession, I'm looking for somewhere, hopefully, God be willing to end my career, but I always want my family safe and welcome, regardless of where I live. So I'm curious what folks have, where you go to get that assurance that at least you're closer to what's right in the world.
I want to make space for my other panelists before I just jump in with the others. Or should I just go for it? Well, so I'll share a couple of things, especially related, I think, to, and also thank you for being such a thoughtful parent of a transgender kid. It's amazing and still all too rare. I think a couple things that I've seen that are starting to gain traction is related to how your state deals with like gender markers on driver's licenses and things like that. So just the whole, there's the healthcare side of things, but then there's also the policy side of things of how will your child be able to identify themselves, and what hoops does the state make you jump through to be able to change things like names, gender markers on licenses and identification, things like that. I think for me, you know, your phase of life matters considerably too, and what to look for. For me right now, I think one of our biggest considerations is laws around parental rights. Now that my wife and I do have a child, making sure that we don't someday move to a place where all of a sudden, like in our case, our first child is biologically related to my wife. It's likely that our second child will be biologically related to me. We don't want to end up in a situation where all of a sudden one of our, where we, like under Colorado, we have the protections we need. If we were to move to another state, all of a sudden, could we be called into question and have our parental rights threatened? So I would, you know, be consulting on issues around whether it's sort of adoption or assumed parenthood, or, you know, things like that. Others who are different phases of life might have like other considerations they'd look into. Perhaps it's retirement benefits for partners, things like that. But I don't know if Steve or Eric, you want to add anything on that one?
Well, I will just say that I think it's an incredibly important consideration that people need to look at and do the homework. I'm fortunate that somehow I accidentally ended up in California 35 years ago, and California, fortunately, has some of the more progressive stances and protections for those in our community. But even in the state of California, I would suggest that there may be differences where you may find the level of comfort different. You know, the urban areas generally are a bit stronger in their support and resources. The rural Central Valley may not be as exciting. So I do think it's important to look at the state level first, but then you also need to dial down to the community and the region and make sure that it's there, because ultimately that's, you know, we always like to say in local government, everything's local. And I think at the end of the day, many of those considerations come down, because I would say, you know, I escaped from Michigan to California and thought I was, you know, supposed to be safe. And that experience ended up, you know, continuing, but it's still positive. But it's incredibly important because, you know, you have to be comfortable. Your family needs to come first.
Great, thank you guys. So I want to get back to Phil's question. Phil, do you want to go ahead and ask your question and fill in? And I think Eric would like to actually answer your question. Are you there, Phil?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering about how people deal with the tension between the code of ethics and our commitment to political neutrality, and what we may feel personally as a commitment to advance certain policies, like what Pam spoke about, you know, the policies that helped her out as a teenager. And so, yeah, I would love to hear Eric's response.
Great. Eric, please.
Yeah, so this is probably one of my most radical opinions related to the ICMA Code of Ethics. I think that is something that needs to be updated in the ICMA Code of Ethics. As a Black man in city management, this past year with the Black Lives Matter protest, asking to speak in front of City Council on numerous occasions about equity issues, it has been incredibly tenuous and frankly impossible to uphold that expectation of the ICMA Code of Ethics that I remain politically neutral, because frankly, when it comes to matters of the safety of Black communities, it's not something that I can just remain quiet on. So I think that I think that that is kind of a relic of a older era of ICMA. I think that you had people who were mostly cisgender, heterosexual white men who were kind of coming up with these guiding principles for the ICMA. And I think that if we're serious about kind of diversifying the city manager pool, that we're going to really need to reevaluate what it means to be ethical and politically neutral.
Well, the first thing I'll say, Phil, is that yes, definitely experience tension in trying to balance that. And more recently, I was on a League of California Cities task force on diversity, inclusivity, and challenging that the league is looking at in terms of its own programs and services. And I did find, there it was a better opportunity to share issues and concerns, but it did seem odd because I'm coming out as one of two representatives in this task force with mostly city council members from the city manager's department. So it is something. And I have to tell you, the first time, a council member wanted to talk about our inclusion policies and updating things, that there was a tension as to how far, because I can write this all up and, where did it want to go? So I won't deny that. I think, it's been, but I do also think, to Eric's point, the conversation about what is appropriate for our community, recognizing the questions of equity and inclusive, and we may need to separate that from ethical, because the ethical there is here's the rules and we're supposed to follow the rules. And I mean, right now, the league is looking at even presenting a toolkit for communities to have, and it's kind of ironic, we're very similar, how do we have those challenging but necessary conversations in our communities? I live in a community of 3,000. That is, our demographic is generally old and older and affluent and well-educated. So we have what they call Bay Area sensibilities, but we also have a group that is, generationally just not comfortable with that conversation. And I have a council that's generally saying we need to figure out and have some of those conversations. So it is interesting, and I'm maybe now at my tenure, I can be a little bit more advocate than I might have been, say, when I was where Eric and Pam and Steve are in their careers. I have a little bit more, capacity to step out of my comfort zone in first thing, and then to work in some of those areas.
So I'd also love to share, because I agree completely with Eric's take, and Steve, thank you as well. I also think part of the answer is actually in the code of ethics. So we have tenet 4, which says serve the best interests of the people, and that means all people. And so to me, when we're talking about sort of foundational issues related to identity and access to services and things like that, I don't see a conflict based on my understanding that is one of our core tenets. I think tenet, and I don't have them memorized, I'm not that good, I just pulled them up on the side, but tenet 7, right, which talks about political activities undermining public confidence in professional administrators. I think that as a profession, I hope we sort of continue to talk and refine what that means. But to me, if I'm going to uphold tenet 4, especially because of my own identity and the experience I know that has, it's my duty, and I believe it is the duty of all of us at ICMA, to do whatever we can to ensure that everyone in our community, regardless of that class or identity, does have the access to services, the ability to be treated as human, the ability to apply for jobs and keep those jobs, things like that. And so I completely think that the tension exists, but I think that we should continue to push that our ethical imperative is to care for our community members of other races and of other identities.
Thanks, Pam. And that's actually a really nice segue to Tammy's question. Tammy, you're asking about how do we constructively engage professional peers who feel that the LGBTQ plus community is wrong. Do you want to expand a little bit, Tammy, or do you want us just to answer the question as best we can?
Yeah, essentially what I was getting at is there are people who have personal convictions that anybody who falls within the LGBTQIA plus community is effectively wrong. There's something wrong about that person. And so they are in opposition to anything that would promote the inclusion of those individuals, that would promote their civil rights and their human rights. And so when you have that kind of opposition, I'm kind of curious to see what the panelists recommend for how to have constructive conversations to help folks see you may feel this way personally, but in this profession, this is what your responsibility is. And this is why these things that we're recommending are appropriate for you to embrace.
Well, and I'll start on that one, and then would love to hear from some of the other panelists. But so I always like to equate it to other things that people might view as wrong and make some analogies. So one of the biggest ones that I like to equate it to is alcohol. There's a lot of people that work for the city or members of the city or even on actually our city council who oppose alcohol, but you can't allow that to dictate your actions and that sort of thing. But one of the things my internal diversity, equity, and inclusion panel has discussed on this matter is it our job to change people's mind? Is it our job to instill our beliefs on them? I don't have an answer for that question. Maybe some of our other panelists do, but what I can say is it's our job to educate people on treating everybody else equitably and not having bias be a factor in how you're treated. And that's where I think we have an educational responsibility to really inform people that it's not okay. You're entitled to have your beliefs, but you're not entitled to discriminate or treat me differently because of your personal values and beliefs. I don't know if any of our other panelists want to comment on this question.
I'm going to take a slightly different take on it that I've experienced a little bit. And it's the expectation, and I'm going to talk about some addition, as a manager, you appoint or hire people. So occasionally, you hire the best and brightest, and you try to get a diverse pool, and you hire a gay applicant. So then you have others in the organization that think you have provided favoritism because you hired somebody that was gay. And I'm just putting that out there because you don't have the same construction, if you will, of a conversation, if a straight person hires a straight person. Now, I will also say, interesting, one of the odder things that I've had to experience is when we were having to discipline somebody, they wanted to use their gay card on me as a approach to try to get out of the situation. And I found that, that didn't work very well for the person, I'll just say that. But I do think those are it's slightly different take on the question in terms of tensions and expectations. I think every once in a while in my career, I felt I had to really, really be on top of my game every time and not let my sexual orientation be seen as influencing. So Phil asks a very good question, because there's a point in time when the real you has to come up and stand up. And that's where I think, Eric and Pam are really telling some really great stories of how they're approaching it. I've done a very different approach, which is much more of a one-on-one deal with a conversation, try to learn where they're coming from, and then focus on, and how does that affect what I'm actually doing? Let's put that aside. And I think, Steve, your spot about a comparison to something else, we need to focus on what are we doing, what are the contributions, what is the issue, and not on the side conversation. And ultimately we need an environment where all of us are, it's not a question. That's what we're really looking for. Why is it an issue? Why does it come up? And I think, that day is still not here yet, but I think we're making tremendous progress, but it's not even. There are certain communities I certainly wouldn't work for, even here in California.
Great, thanks, Steve. And we're about out of time. We do have a couple more questions, but I wanted to leave some time for the panelists to give some final thoughts. So let's go through our final thoughts, but if everyone can take a look at the questions too, we don't want to ignore those. So we'll get some information out to follow up, and certainly anybody on the panel, I think, would be a great resource for further questions and further conversations. So let's start with Steve. Do you have any final wrap-up thoughts?
I think the reality everybody needs to be is deep down, you need to be comfortable with who you are, and make that a priority, and continue to have. One thing I've learned is when I share my story individually or in larger groups, it is helpful. We have to break those barriers and constraints one person at a time, and I find that that's been effective for me in terms of that. And I think people, I would still offer the advice, and you've heard it from many people. You need to do your homework and evaluate the organization and the community that you're moving to, because what I will tell you, having tried to do it once, you can't change the org culture. You can influence an org culture once you might get there, but if you're expecting a certain outcome when you get there, it may not work. So do that homework up front. The good news now is with social media, the websites, you have a lot more opportunity. I mean, you can really look at a community's website and see if they have policies, how does it look, in addition. So I would just encourage that approach.
Thanks, Steve. And Felicia had a great last question. You've spoken to that. So that's what do non-LGBTQ plus people need to know to make an environment more comfortable and less awkward for those of us who are. Let's go to Eric next. Final thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just try to briefly answer that question. I think the most important thing you can do as an ally, in my mind, is just like my city manager did, when people started raising issues or aspersions against me and my sexuality, he immediately brought things back down to the professional level and asked them, what does Eric's sexuality have to do with his ability to do the job? And I think that having that kind of mindset and being able to vocalize that on behalf of LGBTQIA individuals, it makes a world of difference, and we notice it when you do that. My final comment is that I've had kind of a different experience, just the way that I look at where I'm going to go as a city manager potentially. For me, it's where I can make the most impact. And I went to the University of Colorado, Denver. And our program was rural and low income city management. And it just so happens that a lot of those cities who are looking for city managers are conservative. So for me, that's another kind of thing that I keep in my head, and probably part of the driver why I'm willing to conceal my sexuality, at least at the front end. I also believe that there's a lot of people in these communities who are LGBTQIA, and I think that it's really important and powerful that they see that there's members of their community willing to take the risk in a town that might not be supportive of their identities as well. So I just leave you with that.
Appreciate it, Eric. And one thing, just to follow up on that, I also want to just kind of express that, you've heard some of us and some of the conversations been about conservative places versus not conservative places. I do want to highlight there is a significant population of the LGBTQ plus community who identifies as conservative as well, but they experience the same challenges. So they may, fit into very conservative values in certain other realms, but not necessarily, with their identity. So that adds another layer where they may want to actually be in a more conservative environment, but still feel oppressed because of their individual aspects. Yeah, final thoughts.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for tuning in for a couple extra minutes. I think this panel is a really nice reflection and something for everyone to keep in mind, that among what's interesting about the LGBTQ community is, in some ways, right, our sexual orientation is sort of a secondary attribute or tertiary or whatever, and within our community, there's, even among these panelists, we have an incredible diversity of thought, of experience with that part of our identity, of approach. And so I would encourage you all to remember too that while we do have this LGBTQ umbrella, there are some really unique challenges and considerations depending on sort of which letter you represent and which additional qualities that you have. And so it's really important, I think, particularly for allies, to kind of do their own homework and reflect on and understand where your own experiences, while you might not be a part of the community, can still relate to feelings that you may have experienced of what it feels like to be an outsider, or bring those personal experiences and that empathy to bear when thinking about how to approach a colleague or a friend who is part of the community. In terms of making an inclusive environment, I think the last tip I'll give kind of to the managers in the room is, and something we've started doing in Boulder, is be really mindful of the global context that you exist in, and that your workers, your employees, your team members are going to be personally affected by things that happen politically that affect their identity. And that's true for our LGBT colleagues, our Black colleagues, our Asian American colleagues, et cetera. And one thing we've done in Boulder is when we see something happen, whether it's a significant crime or act of violence, whether it's a policy decision that affects a certain part of the community, we send a message from the leadership of the organization to our colleagues who identify that way, saying, hey, we see you. Like, we just did that for Asian American colleagues when there were the string of shootings and increased violence, that said, hey, to our Asian American colleagues, we see you, we appreciate you, we value you, and we're sorry for what is happening in our country. When the Supreme Court rulings come down related to LGBT parenthood, I will be asking our city manager to send a message to the organization, regardless of the outcome, that sort of says, hey, LGBT employees, we see you, we value you, and we will do what we can to support your rights to be parents, regardless of what the Supreme Court says. Things like that really just take a stand, because I will tell you, I have had days where I have been a completely ineffective and unproductive employee because of what's going on in the world and how that affects me personally. And I know that's true for many of our colleagues in this time that we're in. And so the more you can just take that organizational hug, it makes a huge difference for us who often can feel invisible. So I would encourage that.
Thank you, Pam. Well, I want to give a special shout out to Felicia and Tammy for helping us organize this. It's been tremendous. Mark, thanks for joining us. Mark Ott, it's good to see you on the call, and I appreciate your support. This certainly isn't the end of this conversation, and I hope everyone on the call who's either a member of the LGBTQ+ community as well, or interested, or an ally, will help us and help us continue and tell our stories.
And
as my mom.
Thanks to each of you for being courageous and telling your story. Without your stories, we wouldn't have the conversation. So thanks to each of you. And I know our participants will join me in giving you the thank you sign. Yay. I would say that any of our panelists would be very happy to be contacted individually to have further conversations and to get further ideas, especially about how to help non-LGBTQIA do a better job of connecting and including and making life less awkward. So again, thank you all so much for participating. And Margot, thank you for sponsoring this with ICMA, and Lynn Scott as well. And with that, let me also say that the recording will be posted. So if you would like to share it with your colleagues, it will be available later this week. Thank you so much.